So the next chapter, chapter 19, focuses on population ecology. So if you remember in chapter 18, when we did kind of an overview of ecology last week, we talked about lots of different levels that you can look at. And mostly what we looked at in chapter 18 was organismal ecology, in that we looked at things like climate, so rainfall, temperature, elevation, how that would affect different individuals and individuals' ability to survive in an environment. So that was organismal ecology. The next level up, which is what chapter 19 is population ecology. And we've already heard the word population several times before, but really the study of populations is looking at groups of individuals of the same species in the same location and how they interact. And so population ecologists study populations, and they look at how populations change in size over time and how they're regulated. And then they also look at population dynamics. So these are interactions between biotic and abiotic factors that affect populations. So we're not looking at multiple species yet. We'll get to that in the next chapter. We're still looking at one species, but now instead of one individual, we're going to look at several individuals within a population. And if you remember back to the chapter on evolution, a population is the smallest group of organisms that can evolve. So by certain individuals surviving or not surviving within a population, you can lead to changes in that population. And so ecologists studying populations, they're often studying that kind of first point and first potential location of speciation events. Okay. So there's lots of questions that population biologists are interested in. There's some very practical things. So population biologists might look at things like, see if I can get rid of this. They might look at things like how to develop sustainable fisheries. So they might be looking at things like how many fish of a certain species are present in an area and what factors affect the number of species that might be living in an area. They might look at things like controlling pests and pathogens. So there's a lot of work done down here looking at invasive species, and we'll look at that a little bit as we get further along in this chapter. And they're looking at what types of factors influence those pests or those pathogens, what makes them grow faster, what makes them grow slower, what could get rid of them, looking at that. And there's also some population ecologists that study human population growth. So we look at how are human populations growing in different parts of the world, and we'll look at some of the stats from different parts of the world later on in this chapter as well. So human population growth, pests and pathogens, sustainable fisheries, those are all types of questions that a population biologist might look at. Okay. So before you can study a population, you need to know what you're looking at, what a population is. So the first challenge for a population biologist is determining what defines a population. Which individuals are included in the population and which individuals are part of separate populations. What are the boundaries? How big of an area do you look at? So am I going to draw the line at just the Lee County area? Or am I going to look at organisms that are in Florida? Or am I going to look at organisms that are in North America? What region am I looking at, and where do I cut off that? And it's really often not that clear cut, and there often are many ways you can divide up populations. Remember back to our population definition, it is a group of individuals of the same species living in the same area that are interbreeding. So if you have crossed a line to an area where they're no longer interbreeding, that would technically be a different population. And so the first thing they have to do is they have to define the population. And then they often want to know what is the population density, so the number of individuals per unit area that are found in that area. So this just defining your study group, defining your population in ecology is often a very difficult task, much more difficult than you might think. So, how do we measure population density? So in most cases, it's very difficult, impractical, improbable to count all individuals in a population. So you can't just go out and count every single individual. It's something we do here. We count number of students, but even that is not perfect. We don't know exactly at any one time how many students are on campus. We might have an idea of how many classes there are, how many students are on average in each class, but we might not know exactly how many. So most biologists don't try to do things like this. They don't try to count every single individual. Most population densities are estimates based on indirect indicators. So they might, if they're studying birds, they might count the number of bird nests. Bird nests don't tend to move around. They're easier to identify, to count. You can count them from further away. You can go there when the birds are not there and count the number of nests, and it might be easier. For rodents that burrow, they might count the number of rodent burrows and use that as an indicator of how many there might be. So I have an example of this from actually my wife's work on ruffed grouse. So what she did, she studied ruffed grouse, which is the bird that she's kind of looking at here on the road. It is a small kind of forest bird. And she wanted to study ruffed grouse winter behavior. And really her question, her big research question was, what areas do ruffed grouse use in the winter? So where are they found, where are they not found, and really why? She wanted to know what was different about the areas that they were found in than areas that were not found in. And really the ultimate goal of her, this is her master's work, was to develop management plans. So ruffed grouse, very, very tasty. Tastes like chicken. They're a really tasty bird. A lot of people like to hunt them. So they wanted to manage the forest in New Brunswick so that more of these birds would be there. So in order to do that, they needed to know what areas do they really like, what areas do they not like. So she could have gone out and tried to look for birds and try to follow them around and see where they went each day. And this is a method that some places use. So when we're studying panthers down here, they put radio collars on the panthers. There's so few of them, and they're actually very hard to see evidence of, that it's actually more practical for the panthers to know where every single one is. So every one they can get their hands on, they collar, and they now have a radio tracker, they can go out and find them. Not really practical for birds. Also would be insanely expensive. There's so many more of these ruffed grouse that it would be hard to put trackers on all of them. You'd need these very small trackers, which would be expensive, and you'd have to spend a lot of your time looking for them. So what she looked for was poo. So bird poo was her way of knowing that a bird had been there. So grouse poo was very different from other bird species poo. And this is actually her poo room in the cabin that she lived in. She had this room that was dedicated to drying poo. And what they did is whenever they found bird poo, they would mark the location. They'd take a GPS point. They'd put it on their map. They would collect all the poo. And because it was winter, this poo was sitting in snow. And so they'd actually take it back to this room. They'd dry it, and then they'd weigh it. And so they had the weight of the poo and the location it was found. They could go back to the location and they could do all kinds of measurements. They could measure how many trees were there in that area, how thick was a tree cover, what species of trees were there. So they could look at all these different factors. How deep was the snow? How recently had it snowed? They could look at all these environmental and physical factors of the area. And then by weighing the poo, they would have a rough estimate of how long they were there. Ruffed grouse tend to poo at a pretty regular interval. So a lot of birds do this, which we kind of talked about when we were looking at birds, food just passes right through them. So they don't hold on to their food for a long time and then have one big poo. They kind of just poo constantly as they're going. So the more poo there was, the longer the bird had been there. So without even seeing any birds, and she saw a ton of birds while she was there, but not nearly as many birds as bird poo. She would get a good estimate of where the birds were, how long they'd spent there, and all the information she wanted to know without having to radio collar and spend all her time tracking birds. So this is what a lot of ecologists do, use these indirect measurements of where animals are found or where organisms are found. Okay. So something else that population biologists really want to know is they want to know the age structure of a population. The age structure is a distribution of individuals in different age groups. And this tells them a lot about the population. So it tells them whether it's a very young population, whether it's an aging population, what is the turnover like, what is the lifespan of these birds or these organisms. So it tells them a lot of things. The history of a population's survival, reproductive success, or how populations relate to environmental factors can all be determined by the age structure. So in this case, they are going to need to get their hands on organisms because they are going to need to know their age and be able to plot it over time. So if you know where the species are and you know how many there are, so you know the density, you also know the age structure of them, you can then start to develop things called these life tables, which I'll show you on the next slide. So, life tables. So knowing age, knowing density, you can develop this thing called a life table. And this tracks survivorship. What survivorship is the chance of an individual in a given population surviving given their age. So for this table here is a life table for US populations in 2006. So in 2006, if you were between 0 and 10 years old, you had a 99.1% chance of surviving. Basically, 99.1% of individuals that were 0 to 1 or 0 to 10 survived to enter the age group 10 to 20. If you look at 80 to 90 age people, if you made it to 80, then you had a 38.6% chance of surviving to be 90. So your survival rate goes down. And 90 plus, there was no group above that, so it's a 0% there. So they looked at how they got these numbers is they had the number of individuals living at the start of the age interval and the number that died within that age interval, and they were able to calculate what percentage would die within each of those age groups. So what this does is this helps to determine the most vulnerable stages of the life cycle. And with humans, there's a pretty sharp decline. So you're at 99, you're actually less likely to die between 10 and 20 here. You're still at 99, 98, 97, 93. And then when you get into your 60s, it starts going down, but it goes down very quickly in the 80s. So it's really, most humans, they do pretty well up until they're 70 or 80s, and then there's a sharp decline. If we look at other species, there's going to be drastically different kinds of life tables. So what you could do is you could take one of these tables that you've determined by knowing the age structure and knowing the density of these organisms, and you could plot it on a graph, and you'd get something called a survivorship curve. So a survivorship curve plots the number of individuals still alive at each age in the maximum lifespan, and then you can classify the survivorship based on the rate of mortality over the lifespan of an organism. So if you remember that table of human development, you're basically at 99, 98, 99% survivorship through most of your life until about age 60 or so, and then it dropped to about 80%, and then 70 and 80, it was in the 80s, and then in the 90, it dropped pretty quickly to about 30%. So we are what's called a type 1 survivorship curve, where pretty high survivorship for most of the lifespan, and then near the 100% of maximum lifespan, which is the maximum that you see organisms living, there's a pretty sharp decline. So this means that a large percentage of humans live to old age. Right? The opposite of this would be what, like an oyster here, would have a type 3 survivorship curve where most individuals die within the first few years. So, or divide within the first few percentage of maximum lifespan. So there's a large percentage that die young, and then very few that live to old age. And then in the middle there, the squirrel, you have type 2, where there's a pretty consistent decline in individuals throughout the entire lifespan. So they're not all living to old age and then all dying at the same time. There's kind of a regular decline in the number of individuals from year to year. So 3 different types of curve. Type 1 curve, most individuals survive to old age, and then there's a sharp decrease. Type 2, gradual decrease, and type 3, there's a sharp decrease at the start of life, and then a gradual decline over a period of time. So, what this life history trait table and survivorship curve can tell us is they can tell us kind of the traits that will affect the organism's schedule, or tell us something about their life history, which is a set of traits that affect the organism's schedule of reproduction and survival. So based on the survivorship curve, there might be changes in the way an organism determines things like the age of first reproduction. If you're an organism that tends to survive, have near 100% survival till old age, you might delay your age of first reproduction in order for you to grow, to really focus on growth and development of the individual, and then maybe put more energy into your offspring. If you are a population that declines rapidly, it might be more advantageous to reproduce younger because chances of survival are pretty low. Frequency of reproduction, number of offspring, and amount of parental care given can also be dependent on your life history traits, your life, kind of your life history. So what I'm going to show you is two polar opposite life history strategies that kind of go along with those 2 extreme curves, the type 1 curve and the type 3 curve. So here's one that goes along with the type 3 curve. So remember, the type 3 curve is that bottom one, the one that drops off very quickly. So organisms with a type 3 survivorship curve will typically have something called an opportunistic life history. So they will take advantage and take immediate advantage of favorable conditions. So an example of this would be like a dandelion here. So what they do, they will reproduce as early as possible. They will have as many offspring as possible, and they often give virtually zero parental care. Right? They are going to not invest much in each of their offspring, and they are going to try to have as many as possible. So this is called opportunistic life history, and they immediately take advantage of favorable conditions, and they also will burn through resources very quickly. So this is This is the same lifestyle that Corinna brevis, so algal blooming species, does. Basically, when conditions are perfect, it reproduces like crazy, and it uses up all the resources, which is why there's massive fish kills and things in the area. And then it dies back. So they'll often have this very kind of manic stage where they're reproducing like crazy. Okay. So that would be something that has a type 3 curve, where it's very likely that most of these seeds that are being released by the dandelion are not going to survive. If they do find a favorable environment to germinate in, they're probably going to be eaten by something before they survive. So the opposite of this would be an equilibrial life history. So elephants are an example of this. Humans are an example of this as well. So organisms with equilibrial life histories, they mature more slowly. They are not as concerned about reproducing immediately because they tend to have longer lifespans. They tend to not, most of them will survive to older age, right? So they can develop and reach sexual maturity slowly. They will produce much fewer offspring. So the dandelion, you looked at all those seeds that they were producing at once, so hundreds of offspring at once. Humans, typically one at a time. Elephants also have very few offspring at a time, so one offspring at a time, typically. And there's others like this that might have 2 or 3 at a time. And they tend to care for their young as well. So elephants will stay with their family, and they'll grow up with the protection of their family. So what they're doing is they're investing a lot more energy in each offspring, which probably is why more of their offspring survive to old age. So 2 very different strategies. Both of them have positives and negatives. The dandelion doesn't have to invest any energy at all in its offspring, but 99% of its offspring are probably going to die. Right? Whereas the elephant puts a ton of energy into their offspring, chances are much higher that it's going to survive. So equilibrial life history organisms are typically larger bodied and longer lived. So the reason why this might work better for larger bodied individuals is that it takes longer for the young to develop long enough to be able to survive on their own. So they need to be protected maybe when they're really young. Whereas some very fast-growing small organisms don't really need all that much protection when they're young. So this is typically a type 1 survivorship curve. So we have 2 different life strategies. One is a lot of parental growth, parental involvement, slower growth, slower development, and then one is the opportunistic is very rapid, very kind of manic, and very little parental care. Okay, so we've already talked about that. Okay, so the things that affect population size and what causes population size to fluctuate are births and deaths, immigration and emigration. So individuals are born, individuals might come into the area, that's immigration, individuals might leave the area, that's emigration, and then some organisms might die. So I'm going to show you a little clip from your textbook that talks about population growth and different models of population growth in organisms. I think it does a pretty good job of explaining it, so hopefully this plays pretty well on here. And it'll talk about these different strategies. Okay. So, like I was saying on the slide right before that video, there's basically four factors that influence populations. And of course, there's lots of things that lead into what's happening for all these things. But there's 4 things that influence population growth. There's birth and immigration, so birth and organisms moving into the population. Those are positive, will positively affect it. And then there's emigration and death, which will negatively impact it. So if birth and immigration are greater than emigration and death, you're going to get population growth. If immigration and death are greater than birth and immigration, you're going to get decline in population. And if this equals this, you're going to have a steady population. So there's really two major growth curves that I'd like you to know the difference between. There's exponential population growth and there's logistic population growth. In exponential population growth, it's a kind of rapid expansion of population. Birth and immigration are greater than emigration and death. It's constantly growing. And it's, exponential is almost like it's doubling each generation. So it keeps growing and growing and growing. And this is typical of an environment that is ideal and unlimited. So if there is endless amounts of resources and it's a perfectly ideal habitat, there's nothing that is going to cause excessive amounts of death or excessive amounts of emigration, then a population might grow exponentially. Most populations cannot grow exponentially forever. So just like the video said, eventually they're going to run out of something that they need. Either they're going to run out of space, they're going to run out of food, they're going to run out of, some other kind of resource, but typically space and food are the biggest ones. And it's going to cause the population to decline. If they eat up all the food way too rapidly, the population could actually crash out of an exponential growth curve. Okay. So the other major form of growth is logistic growth. Logistic population growth starts out growing pretty well, almost exponential-like, but it eventually starts leveling off. So although birth and immigration are greater than emigration and death at first, emigration and death gradually increase as the population gets larger to a point where they're roughly equal, where the number of individuals that are born equals the number that are died. And this point where birth and immigration equals emigration and death is called the carrying capacity. This is the maximum population size that a particular environment can sustain, and can sustain over a long period of time. So it's going to continue being ideal. So any more than that, and death and immigration are going to increase. When you're below the carrying capacity, birth and immigration might be higher than death and emigration. So what population biologists often do is they want to study what controls this. So what is leading to this carrying capacity? What is the limiting factor? What's limiting the population? Why is it not growing faster? And they also are interested when carrying capacities change. So sometimes we'll see changes in populations. So what has changed in this environment that is now driving this population that was steady, that was kind of at its carrying capacity, to now be either in a decline or to now be in an exponential growth. So this is something we saw with deer in Pennsylvania, pretty much. So deer we're growing exponentially again, and we're seeing all kinds of crazy things happen due to that. And that was because of lack of predators, and so they now need to have regular hunting seasons to limit the population and basically define that upper level so that birth and immigration is not so high that the deer are now found on all the roads, that the deer are not eating all the forest vegetation, things like that. So population biologists will study these things to see, well, what's happening here? Why are we seeing changes to these growth patterns? Okay, so this carrying capacity point will vary depending on many different factors. It will depend on the species that you're looking at, and it will depend on the resources available in the habitat. So what might be a carrying capacity for an organism in one environment might be a really below the carrying capacity in another environment because of changes in environmental conditions. So organism with an equilibrial life history pattern occur in environments where the population size is at or near its carrying capacity. So most organisms with that equilibrial life history pattern are in this logistical growth phase. We'll see the exception, which is humans are a pretty big exception to that, and we'll see that. A lot of organisms that are opportunistic actually will exhibit exponential growth, where they will just eat up all the resources and try to grow as fast as possible in an environment, and then we'll see crashes. So you'll see things like blooms and crashes in those kinds of organisms. Okay. So one of the big things that population biologists do, again, is study what sets these carrying capacities, what sets these limits. And I'm going to go over a few of these things, which the video there just kind of went into a little bit. Okay, so there's basically two different groups of factors that will influence the population's ability to grow. One is called density-dependent factors. A density-dependent factor is a population-limiting factor which intensifies as the population increases in density. So as the population is more and more dense, this factor that is limiting growth, that is increasing perhaps the death rate, will increase in intensity. So competition is a big density-dependent factor. As population sizes increase, competition becomes more intense. So competition between individuals, competition for mate, competition for food resources, things like that. And as competition increases, birth rates often decline. So competition can lower birth rates, and it can increase death rates. There's also density-dependent factors could be accumulation of toxic waste products. So we talked about, and there's kind of a side thing, we talked about brewing wine, I think it was, when yeast produce alcohol, that alcohol is actually toxic to them. And as that alcohol level increases in a vat of wine that's being fermented, eventually it reaches a point where it's going to start killing off the yeast. And at that point, the yeast are going to die. It's going to limit the population. So those toxins that are being produced are a density-dependent factor. They are going to eventually increase the death rate and decrease the birth rate as the population gets more and more populated. Limited food supply, limited territory, these are always big things for animals. As soon as they eat up all their food, they are going to stop growing, and that's something that's going to increase with density. So this is a graph from your book of a bird species that as the number of breeding pairs in a population increases, the average clutch size, which is the number of eggs per pair, actually decreases. So even just the number of eggs that they lay goes down as the number of breeding pairs increases. Probably because there's more competition for food resources, so they can have less investment in their offspring, or less investment per offspring. When they're very low densities, they can have a high investment. There's lots of food resources. The females can sustain producing a lot of eggs, and they can care for a lot of chicks. Okay. So density-dependent factors are related to population density. The opposite of this would be density-independent factors. So there are also factors that will limit population growth that have nothing to do with population density and can cause declines in populations. Some of these are abiotic factors, and these are often abiotic factors, things like fires, floods, and storms, that really, it doesn't matter if the population was large or the population was small. If a fire goes through its environment, it's probably going to kill off a large number of those species, or a large number of those individuals. So you can see large declines certain times of the year during certain catastrophic events that have nothing to do with density. All right. So, density-dependent factors, density-independent factors will all have an effect on the population growth, will have an effect on how long things can survive, and things like that. So some populations will naturally fluctuate in their growth. So they're not going to just go up to their carrying capacity and then hover there, because these factors, these density-dependent, density-independent factors, are constantly changing. So you'll see these cycles, which your book calls boom and bust cycles, where you have periods of rapid exponential growth followed by steep population declines. And we see this in the relationship between snowshoe hare and lynx. Snowshoe hare, the rabbit here, and then the lynx, which is what's chasing the rabbit. The lynx eats the hare. As snowshoe hare, which is the blue line on this graph, increase, not long after an increase in the snowshoe hare, you get an increase in the predator of the snowshoe hare, because it now has more resources, so it can have more offspring and survive better. Because of the increase in the lynx, this is going to increase the death rate of the snowshoe hare. So there's going to be fewer and fewer snowshoe hare. And now, because there's fewer snowshoe hare, it's going to be able to support fewer lynx, so the lynx will start to die off. When the lynx population gets low enough, the hare now will be able to increase their birth rate, and so they'll go up, and the lynx population will follow them. So you get graphs like this, where you see the blue curve is constantly going up and down and up and down, and it's followed by kind of a shadow of the red curve going up and down and up and down. So the lynx and the hare are constantly swapping their position. So as the hare goes up, lynx goes up, causing hare to go down, and then lynx go down. And then hare goes up, lynx go up. So you'll get these constantly. And by studying these two populations, we can get a good idea of the health of this. This is actually a very healthy cycle. If all of a sudden we get rid of a lot of the lynx, the hare population is going to go nuts. And then we're going to see rapid declines in whatever the hare population feeds on. And so you get these kind of interactions. And we're going to talk more about those interactions in the next chapter, but you can kind of see where this is headed. Every species will affect other species further down the line. Okay. So this kind of leads us right into talk of endangered species, because if populations get too low, then it can be difficult for a species to recover from that. So an endangered species, according to U.S. Endangered Species Act, is one that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species, so you may have heard these two words, a threatened species is basically one step away from that. It's one that is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So it means populations are getting low enough that it might become endangered. It might be in imminent danger of extinction. So major factors in population decline tend to be habitat destruction. Really, that is constantly a problem for most organisms, or habitat modification. And so a prime example of endangered species would be the panther down here. As we build more and more golf courses and we build more and more developments, we are eating away at the panther habitat. We're also putting more roads, which is increasing the death rate. So we are lowering the food resources, lowering the habitat resources, which increases the death rate and may lower the birth rate. We are separating away animals, which is separating males and females, lowers the birth rate. And we are building more roads, which are tend to hit panthers. Panthers get hit by cars, so that's going to increase the death rate as well. So we are basically forcing their population to decline. We are lowering the carrying capacity. An environment that may have supported way more animals in the past is now not as supportive. So here's another example of a population that is endangered that you can find around here. So the red cockaded woodpecker is found down in this area, and really it's pretty rare. It requires, so by studying the ecology of the red cockaded woodpecker, we've been able to learn that it requires longleaf pine forests with clear flight paths between the trees. So it requires environment that looks like the bottom picture there, low undergrowth, tall trees, but low undergrowth, so they can have a clear flight path. You can really see through the woods. The picture on top is dense undergrowth, which impedes the woodpecker. So because we live down here, and we don't like fires, because fires burn down our houses, over the last 50 years or so, we've been suppressing fire. And by suppressing fire, the vegetation, the undergrowth vegetation, continues to grow. So fires would normally clear out that undergrowth, wouldn't hurt the trees. Full-grown tree is not going to be destroyed by the fires that they typically get here. The fires are these very quick, kind of rapidly progressing fires, and the trees can survive those, but the undergrowth is burned away. So we've converted the bottom picture into environments like the top picture. So this has lowered habitat. Even though we think of it as woods, it's not the right kind of woods for the red cockaded woodpecker. So what we've been doing in, I think this is Big Cypress area, is controlled burns. So they constantly go out and they burn away that undergrowth to return it to its normal environment. So because we've stopped natural wildfires and we fight natural wildfires, we now have to start our own wildfires and control them so that they don't burn down our houses, but they still maintain the environment for the red cockaded woodpecker. And we're seeing some recovery in their populations. So they were near extinction. They're now going back to near sustainable levels of them. So that's one example. Here's another example of population fluctuations and sustainable management, basically, this is called. So in North Atlantic, in the cod fishery, they had really high estimates of cod stock, and they weren't true. So the number of cod they thought were in these fishery areas was less, or they thought they had way more than they actually had. So fishermen were having these very non-sustainable fishing practices. They were catching cod and they were discarding the young ones that were too small, and which caused most of them to die, causing these high mortality rates. And what happened is the fishery collapsed in 1992, basically because they were overfishing, overharvesting, so the quota rates were way too high, and they were also doing these unsafe practices because they wanted to catch only big fish, and they were only allowed to catch so many, that they were actually killing off a lot of the young cod. So you can see that in the 1960s and 70s, this is just yield, this is the number of fish that were being caught, was pretty high. By the late 90s, it crashed, and it still hasn't recovered. So North Atlantic cod, you really can't fish it anymore. There's not enough out there. And even with no longer fishing that environment, fishing for cod, the population had dipped so low that it hasn't been able to come back yet. So if we had a better estimation of population size in the 60s and 70s, they might have been able to change management practices and put in more monitoring efforts to keep the fishery from collapsing like that. So this is why it's important if you are fishing to follow your quota on your license. So there's a reason why they say you can only take 2 or 3 of this species and only 2 or 3 of this species. It's to maintain the breeding population. Okay, so those are endangered species. Something else that we run into a lot in Florida are invasive species. So invasive species are kind of an opposite case to a threatened or endangered species. Invasive species are non-native species that have spread far beyond their original point of introduction and cause environmental or economic damage by colonizing and dominating suitable habitats. So there's basically two words you might hear down here. You might hear exotic, and you might hear invasive. And sometimes you'll hear exotic, invasive. And exotic is anything that is not native, that is brought in, that is not naturally found in that environment. A lot of the plants that are planted for landscaping down here are exotics. So they are not naturally found here. There are lots of exotics that are not invasive. So they won't reproduce in this environment. Maybe it's not the right temperature, it's not the right amount of rainfall, and so although they can grow here, they're not going to reproduce. And that's perfectly fine to grow here. They're not going to spread away from their point of introduction. But then there are some that do really well here, and they will start growing exponentially, basically, in this environment. So in the United States, invasive species cost about $137 billion a year to eradicate or to control, because invasive species typically exhibit this opportunistic life history pattern, and they just start taking over. And because they are not naturally found here, there's nothing that will set the upper limit. The carrying capacity for them is really not existent because there's nothing that will control them. So we have nothing that eats them, nothing that will stop the population growth. So they just grow exponentially, and they chew up all the resources that are there. They will outcompete local species that might have some kind of predator, have some control over them. So some examples, Burmese pythons. So we get those in South Florida. Kind of what I think is an interesting thing is that your book actually uses tons of examples from Florida. So when it comes to exotics, when it comes to endangered species, we got it all. Burmese pythons are an invasive species. They were set loose in South Florida, either deliberately or accidentally. There's been several cases of pets that are released. People think or they buy a python and they think, oh, it's really cute when it's a baby, and then it grows to be, 15 feet long, and they think, oh, well, okay, I'll set it free. I'll release it into the environment because I'm doing a wonderful thing for it, right? And then it goes out and eats everything. So they're now incredibly abundant in South Florida. They eat native species of birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. There are even pictures of them eating alligators, right? Things like that, and deer, which is crazy. Yeah. So you can actually go to a training course at, what is that? You can take a training course in how to catch them, and you can go out into Everglades and go and try to catch them. But they can be massive, really, really massive. So there's also cases of fish. So if you, do I have a thing? So lionfish, you heard of lionfish? They're really beautiful things. But they're toxic, and they really have no predators around here. They think that, I forget whether that's the one that was released by an aquarium or it was just somebody that released one in the Atlantic, and it's now taken over the Keys, and they're everywhere. They're, again, a fish that grows to a pretty good size. So, if someone had that in their aquarium at home and then it is now this massive fish, they might think, oh, well, I'll just put it in the ocean because fish come from the ocean, right? But it doesn't come from that ocean. And it has no predators there. It's going to grow like crazy. There is a great story of all right, so sometimes this happens because of bad science too. So in Australia, they're growing lots of sugarcane in parts of Australia, and they had a problem with a cane beetle. So a beetle, it was an invasive beetle that I think it was Asian beetle that came in, and it would eat the cane plants and basically reduce their crop production. So one thing that I think it seems to always end up being a bad idea is something called a biological control. And you can introduce a species to eat an invasive species. So the species that was introduced was the cane toad. And the cane toad was supposed to eat the cane beetle, and then once the cane beetles were all gone, the cane toad was supposed to die. That was the theory. Turned out the cane toad didn't much care for the cane beetle, but loved eating everything else, and also reproduced like crazy. And the cane toad, to top it off, has poison glands on its back, so that if anything ate the cane toad, it would die. So nothing ate the cane toad. Right? So nothing would eat the cane toad, and so their populations just went crazy. And there's lots and lots of stories of them in Australia, but you go into kind of northeastern Australia, they're everywhere. You can't drive down the road without running over a few hundred of them, because there's so many of them everywhere. They are even so bountiful that there are bars that do cane toad races, and they use them as kind of pets. People are, so there's craziness that goes on there. Though there is a bird now that apparently has adapted and figured out that it can flip it over and peck at its stomach and eat it that way. As long as it eats its stomach first, it survives. And so there are actually birds that are figuring out how to do this. Okay, so invasive species like Burmese pythons, like cane toads, like the lionfish, tend to have that kind of opportunistic lifestyle where they will take advantage of all the resources. They also tend to have exponential growth patterns. They tend to grow really crazily fast. So let's take a look at humans, because we're always interested in what humans look like. So if we look at the history of the human population, so from about 2,000 to about 500 years ago, so till about 500 years ago, so in about 1500, so with the start of this, before the start of this curve here, mortality was pretty high. Birth and death rates were pretty much equal. So we had basically, in most parts of the world, reached human carrying capacity. That there were plenty of predators, there was plenty of disease, there was limited food resources, that we basically were at a plateau. Then, over the last 500 years, or I guess for about, the world population held steady at about 300 million. So then, as you can see, the last 500 years, we've had this kind of growth curve. And we've basically had this exponential and even beyond exponential growth of human population. We've outpaced what would have been an exponential growth. Though there is predictions now that the world population might decline over the next 50 years or so. So we might have reached kind of our capacity, and we might be, because we've had this exponential growth, we might see a crash in human population. So we're seeing a decrease, actually, in the last few years of the rate of population growth. So still growing, but it's decreasing in how fast it's growing. So worldwide populations in humans is a mosaic. There's a lot of changes occurring in different countries, and there's very different things happening in different parts of the world. So what's happening in the United States is very different than what's happening in countries or in China or in parts of Africa, and it's very different than what's happening in Japan. So in most developed nations, so industrialized, kind of what we historically called first world nations, kind of the very developed nations, the overall growth rate is pretty much near zero. So populations are growing a little bit, but basically birth rate and death rate are pretty equal in most developed nations. There's some exceptions. In developing countries, so in less industrialized countries, the death rates have been dropping steadily. So because of modern medicine, because of a lot of aid, foreign aid, death rates have declined a fair amount, and birth rates are really, really high. So it used to be in those parts of the world that, yes, there was high birth rates, but there was also really high mortality. And now we've lowered the death rates, but birth rates are still really, really high. So population is growing like crazy. So overall, in the entire world, the birth rate per 1,000 is about 19.3, and the death rate is about 8.2. If we look at more developed countries, the birth rate is 11 per 1,000, and the death rate is 10.3, so pretty close to a 0% growth. Whereas if you look in less developed countries, the birth rate is 21 per 1,000, and the death rate is 7.7, so about a 1.3% growth. So they're having a positive growth rate there. So really the overall world growth rate is pretty much based on the developing worlds, or developing nations. So if you want to know what's going on in an individual country, you're going to look at a chart that looks more like this. So these are age structure diagrams. An age structure diagram can help you predict what might happen to a population in the future. And I'm going to show you a few from different countries, but here's two different ones from different countries. The one on the left is a chart from Nigeria. And what you will notice is that it's a pyramid shape. Right? So a pyramid shape says that there are a lot, or the larger percentage of individuals are young. So the blue lines represent 0 to 14 years old. The green lines represent 15 to 44. So the green lines really are the breeding population of reproductive age. The blue lines are the children. And then the orange lines are people that are above the breeding age, and it's much, much less in the 45 to 85. So this pyramid shape represents rapid growth. So these individuals in the green zone are having lots and lots of children, and just imagine 10 years from now when those 14-year-olds are 24, there's going to be a larger breeding population, and they're probably going to have even more children. Right? Whereas on the right, we have Japan's growth curve. And you'll notice that it's kind of this almost hourglass shape, but it's almost straight up and down, but there's actually less on the bottom than there is on the top. So you have an aging population. You have a lot of people that are above 45, a lot of people that are outside of the breeding range, and you're having basically less than one child per reproductive adult. And so this is this is negative growth. You're having less children than adults. You're basically having less than one per, you're not replacing your rate. Whereas in Nigeria, you are having more than one per reproductive adult. Okay. So some things that these age structure diagrams can do is they can indicate social conditions. Expanding populations like Nigeria are very soon they're going to need lots of schools. There's going to be an increased need for employment as these younger individuals age, and lots of infrastructure developments for them as they go. Whereas an aging population is going to need fewer schools because the population is declining, so you're going to have fewer and fewer individuals, and you're going to need more care for the elderly. So if we look at trends in age structure in the United States from 1985 to predicted 2035, it reveals several different patterns. So here's several different age structure diagrams for the U.S. On the furthest left is from 1985, the one in the middle from 2010, and the one on the right is a predicted one for 2035. And you can see in the 1985 one that there's this bulge. That's your baby boomers, if you remember. There basically was a large increase in birth rates post World War II, and they had lots and lots of children at that time. And so you can see that there actually is kind of a declining rate below that. But because they are all of reproductive age, their children will move up into the reproductive age in a few years. In 2010, we see that aging boom population has moved up. They are now more elderly, and we see this kind of, I don't know, change in the shape of the two curves. So although we had this kind of almost triangle shape probably in the 50s and 60s, it's gone more toward this kind of straight up and down curve where we're not really seeing growth or destruction of them, or depletion of human population. So this, if you look at this, it might make you think of what kinds of things that human population might need. In 1985, there was a larger need for jobs because we had a lot of reproductive age people. There was probably a need for schools for those people's children. In 2010 and now, we're seeing a large increase in the aging population, which is why Florida is doing pretty well. We have a lot of people retiring and moving down here. So there's going to be a lot of need for health care and elderly care. And we're seeing less of a smaller population that's in that breeding range. All right. Let me see. So the last thing I want to go into in this chapter is kind of not just related to humans, but to all organisms. All organisms, all populations have what's called an ecological footprint. It's an estimate of the amount of land required to provide raw material that individuals or a nation might consume. This includes food, fuel, water, housing, and waste removal. So different populations, dependent on their age structure, dependent on their growth rate, will have different ecological footprints and different needs. So in the US, the ecological footprint of the United States is on average 9 hectares per person, and represents about twice what we can support. So it's about twice, if we looked at the number of people in the United States and calculated 9 hectares per person, that's twice of the amount of land that we have. So affluent nations like us, because of overconsumption, because of overpopulation, we often consume greater than our land has, and so we have to take resources from other parts of the world in order to sustain our population. So if we were to plot kind of hectares per person on a global level, this is the map that you come up with. So you can see that the US consumes way more than most other countries. Australia does a fair amount of consumption. Parts of Europe are a little bit higher. Canada is still higher than in some parts of the world, but if you look at developing nations, so nations in Northern Africa, in South America, and China, the hectares per person is much, much lower. So there's a big disparity between resource consumption in more developed and in less developed nations, just due to lots of factors. So because of our consumption, if we're not able to pull resources from other parts of the world, we would see increase in death rates or decreases in our ability to supply the resources that we need. All right, so this is an introduction to population ecology. Lots of different things to think about. It's really just kind of an overview of the different questions that population ecologists look at, and then a little bit on humans. but really just learning the different terms that are related to these, learning the different types of growth and the different types of factors that might affect growth. That's really the overview here. So what we're going to talk about after the holiday on the last kind of last chapter for this book, we're going to talk about community ecology, which is looking at how do different species interact with each other. So how do plants and animals interact? How do parasites and hosts interact and things like that? And we're going to look at more of those kind of dynamics. And that's kind of the last little introduction to ecology that we'll get into. All right, so that's it for this chapter. I'll stop there. Yep.